Hello, and welcome to Fierce Conversations with Toby, the show where we talk about the hard things. I'm Toby Dorr. In today's episode, we'll learn that you may go to prison even if you're innocent. Our guest today is Justin Brooks, the director and co-founder of the California Innocence Project and a tenured professor of law at California Western School of Law in San Diego. Over the course of his career, he has served as counsel on many high-profile criminal cases and has exonerated dozens of innocent people, including former NFL player Brian Banks. Professor Brooks has been recognized several times by the Los Angeles Daily Journal as one of the top 100 lawyers in California. And in 2010 and 2012, California Lawyer magazine honored him with the Lawyer of the Year award. Professor Brooks has founded innocence organizations throughout Latin America, speaks around the world about innocence work, and is the author of the only legal casebook devoted to the topic of wrongful convictions. He is portrayed by Academy Award-nominated actor Greg Kinnear in the feature film Brian Banks. So welcome to the podcast, Justin. I'm delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
I like to ask all my guests a question at the beginning that kind of gives us a peek into who you are. What's your favorite color, and what does that say about you?
I'm pretty sure by the clothes that I wear, it's blue, because I wear a lot of blue. I wear usually a blue exonerate shirt, which is the license plate on my car, and kind of has become the symbol for the California Innocence Project. So
I've
probably
noticed that.
Probably what that says about me is I never put down my work. I'm always wearing it.
I love that. I can relate to that, actually. Can you tell us about a crossroads in your life that pushed you in a different direction?
Sure. And I think like most people, there's been several, but the one that sticks out in my mind and the one that kicks off my new book, You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent, is that 27 years ago, I was a law professor in Michigan, just having a nice little life, teaching law and living in East Lansing, Michigan. And I'd given up my practice as a criminal defense attorney in Washington, D.C., to have this quiet academic life. And I read about a woman on death row in Chicago who had been sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that sentence makes no sense, right? That you could be sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And so I set up a meeting with her on death row. She was scheduled to be executed. And she told me that she was innocent. So I said, "You're innocent. You pled guilty, and you're going to be executed." Yes. So I went back to the law school where I was teaching, and I told exactly that to my students. I said, there's this woman on death row. She's 21 years old. She's sentenced to be executed. She says she's innocent. Who wants to help me out? And 4 kids raised their hands. And that night, we sat around my kitchen table, and we started going through the police reports. And, that case changed the entire trajectory of my life. I ended up getting her death sentence reversed. I quit my job as a tenured faculty member out in Michigan, and I moved to California, and I started the California Innocence Project. And since then, that's what I've been doing. I've been investigating claims of innocence of people in prison, working on those cases with law students to use the cases to train them to be good lawyers. And I've been lucky enough to walk 37 innocent people out of prison in the time I've been doing it.
I think that's just beautiful. There is, one thing I learned through my own journey through the justice system is that it's not just. There's all kinds of idiosyncrasies and unfairnesses. And I think it's awesome that there's a group out there who tries to right those wrongs. So you might go to prison even though you're innocent. What a title. How did that title come to you?
Yeah, that's a great question that no one's asked me before. I guess it's, I've been talking about this topic for so long. I've been teaching about it for so long. I've given hundreds of lectures on it. I've done all these cases. And, really, that's the summation of all of it. And And, it's funny. I literally have in my own head what would be my plan if I went to prison because I've seen so many innocent people in prison that I know that
Mhm.
could happen to me, could happen to
Right.
anybody. And,
Yeah.
my plan, by the way, which is not one that everybody could use, but is that, on the first day in prison, I would gather all the shot callers, all the gang leaders on the yard, and I'd say, I'm going to be your lawyer and your lawyer and your lawyer and your lawyer. I'll
That's an excellent plan. I love it.
keep all these other
Yeah,
dudes
talk
away
about
from me.
yes, that's right. Talk about having an easy life in there. That'd be the way to go.
Yeah, if I
So,
can pull that off.
yeah. Well, hopefully you never have to, because
Hopefully I
it's
won't. But
certainly
again,
not a fun place to be. You never know.
you
Honestly, you
never
never
know, and
know.
that's what the
Mhm.
book is all about. So the book is divided into 10 sections of kind of the 10 themes I've seen in my career of what lead innocent people to prison, and many of them are just
Mhm.
unavoidable.
Yeah.
Some are avoidable, like, I've got a chapter on all the baby death cases that I've dealt with. And yeah, if you
Mhm.
never have children or you don't allow children in your home or you don't operate, as a daycare provider, if you spend the rest of your life staying away from children, I guess you could avoid that wrongful conviction. But I've seen
Mhm.
daycare providers, parents, all kinds of people wrongfully convicted in baby death cases that were misdiagnosed. I talk about
Wow.
that if you live in rural areas, often the police don't have the capacity to process homicide scenes, so they make all kinds of
Mhm.
mistakes. If you live in the
Mhm.
inner city, lots of those neighborhoods are over policed. And so that leads
Mhm.
up to wrongful convictions.
Right. And they're just looking for somebody to put something on. So, yeah,
Yeah. And
you're
then the
right.
leading cause of wrongful conviction is unavoidable for all of us because the number one cause of wrongful conviction in the United States is misidentification. And my
Mm.
chapter on that is called You Sort of Look Like Other People in the World because you can be wrongfully
Yeah.
identified.
Mhm.
People's memories are terrible. I often
Mhm.
talk about, when I talk about it with jurors or with groups of people, and let me ask you this, Toby, has this ever happened to you? That you're in a restaurant and you order some food and you're looking right at the waiter or waitress and it's bright lights and you're
Mhm.
not afraid and no one has a gun in your
Mhm.
face and
Mhm.
you order, let's say, the tomato soup, and the waiter or waitress walks away, and you think, you know what, I think I'd rather have the potato leek soup. And then you look
Mhm.
up, think, who was my waiter
Who
again?
was my waiter? Right. I can so relate. Yeah, who you don't remember. I can
And
relate to that. Yeah.
that is the best possible identification scenario. You're doing
Mhm.
the ID
Mhm.
moments after you've seen the person. You're not
Mhm.
afraid, so your memory doesn't get distorted. You're not having weapons focus because they're not carrying a weapon.
Mhm.
You may hopefully you're not intoxicated, but a lot of times all those things impact how
Right.
identifications are done. And sometimes those
Mhm.
IDs are done hours later, days later, months later. I've seen identifications done years later that then stand up in
Mhm.
court. And it's so ultimately the conclusion was it is unavoidable that you might go to prison even though you're innocent. Now, statistically, most
Mhm.
people don't, but people play the
But
lottery
it's
every day.
always possible. That's right. It's always possible. I can so relate to that. And I found that the prison system is really hidden to the general public. It's out of sight, out of mind. When people
Mhm.
go into prison, the society in general never gives them a second thought. So even if there is some doubt about their conviction, nobody follows through with it except, for people like you. And I know that you know the stats, but our listeners may not. The United States has the highest percentage of incarcerated people in the entire world. What does that say about us as a country?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shocking statistic, and I'm happy that
Mhm.
you focused on the most important statistic because first of all, we have the
Mhm.
largest prison system in the world, but people will say, "Well,
Mhm.
we've got a large population." I always counter with that by saying China has fewer people in prison and they have a billion more people than us. But we
Mhm.
have the
That's right.
highest percentage. So if you think about
Mhm.
the fact that much of crime is connected to economics and we are the
Mhm.
wealthiest country in the world, why is the wealthiest country in the world locking up the highest percentage of its population? that makes no sense until you start
You're right.
examining it. Yeah, it
It's
makes no
just
sense.
baffling. Yeah, and to me, it says that our solution to every problem is throw them in prison. And, I think you asked some of these hard questions in your book. Questions like, what behaviors should be criminalized to truly serve society? Do we really make a better country if we throw someone in jail because they didn't pay child support? I mean, are they really criminal? How are they going to pay their child support when they're in jail because they didn't pay child support? You know, so what are your thoughts about that? The behaviors that we should criminalize?
Yeah. So I'm not somebody who can be dismissed by people saying, well, you're some liberal who thinks, no one
Mhm,
should be locked up. I do believe that there's a percentage of our population who are violent, who we need to be protected from, and
mhm,
they need to be isolated from the community. Now, I would love it if we would be doing something positive with those people because I think that even people who have violent tendencies can be rehabilitated. There's a very
mhm,
small percentage of the population that can't be rehabilitated, and it's a tiny
mhm,
percentage. I spent 3 years working in a prison when I was a young lawyer, and people say, "Are you scared going in there?" And I'd say, "No." I teach a class in the prison. Most of the guys that are in there on drug charges, or they're in there on
mhm,
nonviolent offenses. Even the guys who are in there on violent offenses, it's mostly under control. And so, there's so many things. You're absolutely right that we use the criminal law to solve our societal problems in a way that doesn't solve them. It just hides them
mhm,
away. And they're always a short term solution because people in our democracy need to get reelected. In Congress, it's every 2 years, and a lot of other
mhm,
offices every 4 years. So politicians look for short term solutions that will just make the statistics look good. So if they lock
mhm,
up a lot of people and they can make a dent in the crime statistics in the short term, that helps them. And then, of course, the corrections industry benefits from this, so they fund the politicians that pass the tough on crime laws. So it's
mhm,
win-win for the politicians. They can take money from the corrections industry, create policies that help them get reelected. It's lose-lose for the
mhm.
rest of us because we're
Right.
paying billions of dollars to lock up citizens that could be productive. And then in a lot of cases, we're paying for social services for their families because we've taken out a person from their family that could provide for the family. And it's this
Mhm,
evil cycle that keeps going. So, one example is when I started practicing law in DC, I would see my clients who were sex workers getting locked up. And it was so pointless. It was,
mhm,
first of all, we were spending $100,000 a year on each one of them in processing costs and incarceration costs.
mhm.
And then how does putting somebody in jail turn them away from the life as a sex worker? All it does is make them less employable, have more
Right.
psychological issues.
Yeah, the
They're
reality is it throws them back there even stronger because, I had a college degree when I went to prison and I never didn't get a job I interviewed for, but I could not find a job when I got out of prison. So I had a college degree and I couldn't even get hired at PetSmart. So what happens to the people like you talk about the women on the street who maybe didn't even graduate from high school? What chance do they have of turning their lives around? I mean,
But we
they
want to
just
make
don't.
a and it becomes this sort of it is where the law is just always a response to societal issues. When I lived in
Mhm,
Michigan, I had a debate with a woman on a radio, which is a perfect example of what we're talking about, where she said she thought they should raise the age of consent for sex in Michigan to 21. And she said, because I think it's a good idea that people wait till they're 21 to have sex. And I said, ma'am, what's a good idea and what we should be incarcerating people for are vastly
are
different. You're saying
that's right. Mhm,
a couple of undergraduates at University of Michigan who are 20 years old and have sex, you want them incarcerated for 10 years for that. And that's I think people don't really get that. And the legislatures sometimes don't even care. It's whatever the public supports. But when we
mhm,
criminalize everything we think is a good idea, all we do is fill our prisons and create a population of people that become less employable and less likely to succeed in our society.
mhm. And there is a financial incentive to incarcerate people because there are companies out there who make so much money off of prison phone calls, prison commissary, and not to mention all the labor that the inmates are required to do that they get paid pennies for, to that put money in some corporation's pocket. Uh, it's just so hard to overcome that because, in America, money is what drives everything. And if there's a profit to be made, then that makes it even harder to fight against it.
Yeah, the
Um,
industry is massive for what you just talked about, and the
mhm.
phone thing is the most frustrating because
It's
it's the
ridiculous.
last collect call. Most of us can barely remember collect calls from 30 years ago, and
Uh-huh.
if
Right.
you're not over 40, you probably don't even remember collect phone
Mhm.
calls.
Mhm.
I have a huge phone bill because my clients will have to call me collect from prison.
Mhm.
And these
That's right.
families, when a child wants to talk to their parent that's incarcerated, the family is going to be stuck with a big bill for doing that. And what did that
Mhm.
child do? If we really step back and think,
Right.
we're watching these families that did nothing.
That's it, correct. I had a really close friend, thank goodness, when I was in prison, and I called him every day. And I never knew it. He told me after I got out of prison, but his phone bill every month was more than his car payment
Mhm.
because I called him every day. And most families can't afford to absorb that extra cost. It's just ridiculous.
No, and then they
And so,
also have to I was just gonna say they also have to absorb costs that I talk about in my book that people don't think about. Is, for example, in California, we build the prisons out in the desert where land is cheap. It's often hundreds
mhm,
of miles away from the cities where most of the
mhm,
families live. A lot of
that's
them don't have
right.
cars that can make it for those
Mhm,
visits. A lot of times they
mhm.
got to pay to stay in a motel the night before so they can get online at 5 in the morning and get a chance of a visit. It's all that stuff that we don't consider because as you open this conversation, prisons are literally designed to hide all this stuff away, and
That's
only
right.
people there know about it, and people they're close to.
Yeah, the general society has no idea of what goes on. And I don't know about generally in prison, but the prisons I was in during my 27 months, never once was there any kind of a program to rehabilitate anybody that I ever saw. And statistically, the majority of inmates are released at some point. And
Mhm.
so, how are we creating and serving society when we're turning people out that we've damaged during their incarceration? How are those people supposed to come back and be productive members of society? So that's something else that needs to be considered, I think. And so, how do you coach your people that you help get out of prison? Some of these people I know have been in for decades, long time. What do you find is the hardest thing for them when they come out of prison?
Yeah. So, ugh, it's a long list, but, it
Mhm.
starts with well, for example, my client, Mike Hanline, he spent 36 years in prison,
Wow.
completely set up, in this murder case that ultimately they also paid him a lot of money as a result and admitted wrongdoing.
Mhm.
But 36 years in prison. And in fact, there's a video on YouTube that your listeners can watch called Man Eats Hamburger After 36 Years. And it's me
Ah.
me just taking him out for his first meal, and he's even struggling to figure out how to order, in the restaurant. But the thing that they struggle most with is choices because they haven't been
Mhm.
given choice for so long.
Mhm.
And then, like just going to a supermarket, I had one client call me from the toothpaste aisle because he was having a panic attack because he couldn't choose
Mhm.
between it because we we,
That's
we
right.
take that away from you in prison and just tell you
Mhm.
everything. But technology is the biggest struggle. Mike
Mhm.
was an auto mechanic when he went to prison. And then 36 years later, he gets out and he starts looking at car engines and he doesn't recognize any of them because he says they're all
Mhm.
computers now.
That's right.
I got him an iPad so he could do therapy because he wanted to live in a remote area because he had trouble dealing with people and crowds.
Mhm.
And, and no matter how simple I tried to make it, he just could not operate it. The concept of the internet made no sense to him. And it's
Mhm.
exactly what you're talking about. In California, my clients don't have access to computers. in
Mhm.
prison. So when they come out, if they went to prison in the 80s, they don't know how to use so many things. And in the course of a
Right.
day, they don't know how to
Mhm.
use a smartphone. They don't know how to use a
Mhm.
computer. And that's part of making them unemployable. And so we spend a lot of time with them on therapy and getting them training and assisting them. But it's
Mhm.
getting more difficult every year for my organization, the California Innocence Project, because we're lawyers who are freeing innocent people from prison. But often we get put into the role of social workers. And as we
Right.
free more and more
Yeah.
clients, with more and more
Mhm.
people to take care of, but yeah, I don't think the general public truly understands what prison can do to you in terms of
Mhm.
your psychological abilities to move forward, and then just in terms of dealing with day to day life, the things that we all take for granted.
Mhm. That's true. I served 27 months, which was a short sentence relatively compared to most people. But it just so happened that during that 27 months I was in prison, the smartphones came out and Facebook came out. Those things didn't exist when I went to prison. And I'm a pretty technological person, but it's still an adjustment when you come out and you don't know how to use these new technologies. And I remember the first weekend I was home, my brother, wanted to make it special for me. And so he took me out to lunch and took me to a movie. I had a panic attack in the movie theater because it was so dark and there were people behind me and I could hear them rustling and doing something and I couldn't see what they were doing. And I had to spend my whole movie in the lobby because I just couldn't adjust. That's after 27 months. I can imagine after 36 years, how you would adjust. It's just a horrific thing. One of
Yeah.
my closest friends was executed by the federal government 2 years ago. And I have to say, it was one of the most horrific experiences I've ever been through. For those of us who loved her, and everyone in prison generally has people who love them. So, how do you keep your heart from being broken when you don't have success in some of these cases?
I don't know if I do. Um,
Yeah.
to be honest, I mean, when everybody sees our wins, those become big news stories, and you see people walking out with their hands in the air. But we lose a lot of cases, and
Mhm.
the loss means that we've gathered all the evidence that they're innocent, and a judge just refuses to grant a hearing,
Mhm.
or we get a hearing and a judge denies it. And in my
Mhm.
office, we all kind of sit out in our little lounge area and my lawyers all cry and everyone kind of goes back to
Mhm.
their office, and then you kind of hear everybody going home one by one,
Mhm.
and the next day we just start over again. But those losses stay with you forever.
Yeah.
They're
I think it's a good thing that your heart gets broken because if it didn't, then you probably shouldn't be working in the field you're in. So I love that answer. I think that's so true. And I'm sure you have a lot more requests than you can handle. So, what
Mhm.
makes a case push itself to the top of your pile?
Yeah, so we receive thousands of requests a year, and
Hmm.
I'm very lucky that I've got 8 full-time staff attorneys. I've got 100 volunteer attorneys. I've got any
Hmm.
given time anywhere from 12 to 30 law students and a bunch of other volunteers. I've got college students, I've got retirees, and they all read through all the letters, and we send out questionnaires to the incarcerated people that they give us all the information about their case. Then a law student will read their transcripts, their pleadings, their appeals, and they'll write an intake memo. And then every case that then moves into the system, ultimately a lawyer will review it. And if the case has any possibility, and because there's some cases that just they're not winnable. For example,
Hmm.
drug cases, I've only ever won one in my career, and I won that one in Nicaragua. I've never won one in the United States
Oh,
because in the
yeah.
United States, there's only two elements to a drug case, and that's, you had drugs and you knew you had drugs. Now, I see a lot of drug cases where the person very well might be innocent. It's four
Hmm.
kids in a car, they get pulled over. In one kid's backpack, there's drugs. But under
Hmm.
California law, they can all be charged with possession. And if they went to court and the jury didn't believe them that they didn't know that other person had drugs, there's nothing I can do about that case. So a
Oh.
lot of cases get stopped right there. If they do
Mm-hmm.
have possibility, we'll have a presentation with the lawyers and the law students. I have the awful Caesar-like power of thumbs up or thumbs down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then cases kind of move through the process of investigation until we either
Mm-hmm.
develop the evidence we need to win or it gets closed. And it's
Mm-hmm.
heartbreaking because I see a lot of
Yeah.
people that have terrible representation. I see a lot of terrible decisions. I see a lot of injustice that I can't do anything about because I have
Mm-hmm.
the burden of proving innocence with my cases. That the prosecution had the
Mm-hmm.
burden at trial, but now I need
Mm-hmm.
compelling evidence of innocence to reopen that case. And oftentimes you have innocent people, you just can't develop that evidence. And
Right.
it's very, very hard. It's the hardest part of the job is screening the cases, picking up on the ones we feel we can win, and then going out and winning them.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine, and I'm sure it's a pretty time-consuming process as well. You can't go through all that evidence and determine, in the blink of an eye. I bet you have months and months, if not years, into every case that you consider. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a big
and
job.
thank God for the miracle of law students and
Mm-hmm.
volunteers, because it would be impossible to pay for what we do.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I've got, donors. I got the project off the ground through a donation from Joe Walsh and the rock band The Eagles. They
Oh,
were my first
wow.
big. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
they really
That's pretty
supported
cool.
us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a kind of a cool story to start with. To start with the Eagles, and then
Yeah, that is pretty
from
interesting.
there.
Yeah. So I've heard it said that a society is only as good as the way they treat their inmates. How can we, the public, help your mission?
Yeah, it really is a test of how we
Mhm,
care about people. I often say it's our criminal justice system, right? It's out there to protect us and our families
mhm,
and serve us. So since it's our criminal justice system, we all have a responsibility to make sure it's working right, not to just sit
mhm,
back and go, "Oh, okay, well, I guess they made a mistake." Well, the they is
mhm,
us because
mhm.
we have
That's
jury
true.
trial. Yeah, it's us. We pay for it. We have
Mhm,
jury trials, and it's what protects us every day.
mhm,
So we're either part of the solution or part of the problem.
mhm,
So, what can people do? Well, obviously, supporting organizations like the California Innocence Project, I'd love, and
mhm,
people can go to californiainnocenceproject.org to see about doing that,
mhm,
and innocence projects all over the country to support. But being informed jurors, being informed voters, the things we talked about earlier, not being easily manipulated by politicians into voting for tough on crime policies based on emotion,
mhm,
recognizing things like the corrections industry. We've now allowed the correctional officers unions to be among the most powerful unions in the United
mhm.
States, and that's
Yeah,
crazy.
it is
Um,
crazy.
yeah, it's
I
it's
was in a
breaking.
for-profit prison for 15 months, a for-profit prison. Now that's an oxymoron. I
Mhm.
fell and broke my leg, and it took them 10 days to x-ray it. 10 days.
Wow.
Because it it was a cost that they didn't want to incur. I mean, I think for-profit prisons are just shouldn't even be allowed. I think it's the worst thing we've ever done. Um,
Yeah,
I think
I
another
agree,
thing
but
that we could
another
do.
another
Go
point on the
ahead.
for-profit prisons, though, I think sometimes gets lost is people think the prisons that aren't for profit, but really all
Right,
prisons
that's
are for
right.
profit,
They really are.
right?
You're exactly right. Everything comes down to a budget and the bottom line. You're right. That
Yeah, they
is
may not
true.
be privately built or privately managed, but
Mhm.
there's an industry
Mhm.
behind them. That's
That's
money that's
true.
going in. They're not
That's
government
true.
workers, but
There that's right. There are so many industries out there that I think if the public knew that all the labor came from in prison inmates, they would be stunned. The prison I volunteered in, all the uh, college athlete clothing that was embroidered in that prison for the entire country. And those inmates make hardly nothing compared to what the embroidery operators outside the prison make.
you know,
One thing I think that we could do pretty easily as a society to make the justice system a better thing is to serve on juries. So many people get jury summons and they say, how can I get out of this? What can I do to get out of this? I just don't want to be bothered. I think we should be bothered because someday it might be someone we love that is the defendant in a jury trial. And I would like to think that you have a variety of people and, intelligent people and compassionate people and people who weigh either side of an issue serving on those juries, and not just people who have nothing else better to do.
Right. Well, I've got jury
Yeah.
duty next week, and I will be going in
Oh,
as usual, and I will
I
get
wonder if
kicked
they'll
off.
pick you.
No, I will probably get kicked off as usual, but I'm going to keep
Really?
going. And
Yes,
you're
yes.
absolutely right. You're
Hmm.
absolutely right.
Yeah. So, what's one question you wish I'd asked you, and how would you have answered it?
Where's my book available? You might go to prison even though
Oh,
you're innocent.
yes. Excellent. I'm glad you have a picture of that to put up there because I don't have a hard copy of it yet. And we are going to include a link to your book as well. So we'll
Perfect.
get that covered for you. All right. Well,
Excellent.
thank you so much, Justin. It's been a pleasure having you on, and I'll be right back with you in just a moment. Remember, none of us is our worst mistake. We all have so much more to offer the world. And those so-called mistakes are often blessed opportunities to learn and grow. Next week, we'll continue to bring you inspiring stories by people who've identified a need for change and are working to make a difference in the world. Subscribe to our Patreon channel, Fierce Conversations, for special access and behind-the-scenes info. Go to patreon.com/Fierce Conversations or click on the link in the show notes. 10% of the Patreon proceeds are dedicated to providing workbooks to women in prison. The show notes will also provide a link to Justin's new book, You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. And I'm also going to include a link to the YouTube video about Man Eats Hamburger After 36 Years. There'll be a link to purchase my memoir, Living with Conviction. As I talk about in depth in my memoir, I had a conversation while in prison where my friend Lisa told me, in here, we can talk about all the hard things. In fact, I think we must, and so we shall. This is Fierce Conversations with Toby, where we talk about the hard things. Until next time.